Hello, I'm Jerry Skinner. I want to tell you a video we did a while back that we called The End of the Cattle Drive. I've often wondered what it would be like to actually be on a real cattle drive back in the 1870s. We tried to make the video as realistic as possible. Found out I may not have wanted to ever be on a cattle drive because it was rough. Let me tell you, it was rough. It all started in 1865 when all the boys come back from the Civil War. Now that's for my northern friends. Or when they come back from the war between the states. That's for my southern friends. When they left their cattle out on open range. When they come back, they had multiplied. I mean, really multiplied. Over 1 million longhorn cattle was roaming Texas. Problem was, price was almost zero. Of course, they learned that in New York City and places east, the prices were extremely high. They had to figure out a way to get their cattle to the east. They actually couldn't do it till the railroad come to Kansas. Then they decided that they were going to bring all their cattle together, and each rancher had their own brand. That was so they could distinguish one from another. I knew they were all branded one time, but I didn't know they were branded twice. Because once they come into the herd, the drive itself had its own brand. And of course the reason is so they could distinguish their herd from other herds. So the cattle were branded twice. They started out in the spring, of course, because there was plenty of grass and the weather was good. They traveled 600 miles from Texas to Kansas. Most of them went up what's called the Old Western Trail, or some people call it the Kansas Trail or the Dodge City Trail. Millions of cattle through a 20-year period went up the Dodge City Trail. The cowboys stayed in the saddle almost 14 hours a day. And at night, they would have to spend 2 hours watching the cattle to keep down stampedes. And what they'd do is, there'd be two to a shift. One would ride around the herd clockwise, and the other one would ride around the herd counterclockwise. And at the same time, they would sing to the cattle to keep them calm. Evidently, they'd never heard me sing. Now, before the drive started, they would have to pick trail boss. Now, the trail boss was like the captain of a ship. Whatever he said went. No question. He was responsible to see that as many cattle got to the railhead as possible. Everything rested on his shoulder. After him, the wranglers, or what some people call drovers, others just cowboys. They had certain positions that they held. There actually was a hierarchy on the cattle drive. After the trail boss, the point riders. And what they did was they stayed one on each side, and their idea was to guide the cattle. And they would steer the cattle in the direction that the trail boss had pointed out. After the point riders, there was the swing riders. They were about a third of the way back on the herd or from the point riders. There was one on each side. And their idea was to keep the herd together and to keep them going in the right direction and following the point riders. Then back about 2/3 from the point riders was the flank riders. Now all of them would go after strays. If they seen one going or straying off, they would go get it. They couldn't afford to lose many because they were so high priced. And right at the end was the drag riders. They were usually the most unexperienced riders. They got paid the least. After that, we had the wranglers, was usually a young man who had very little experience, and what they did was they put him in charge of the horses that they all rode. They would sometimes change horses 3 or 4 times a day because they were always running their horses to bring this cow back in or that cow back in. And they had to have the Bermuda, they called it, close to the cattle so that the cowboys wouldn't have to ride so far to get their horses. After the wrangler was the cook. The cook was the second most important man on a drive. He also made the second highest salary under the trail boss. The cook was responsible for all the meals, which became very important. Whatever the cook said, if you want to eat, you better do it. And he had a lot of times an assistant that they called Little Mary. It was just a young man, a young boy most of the time, that would assist the cook by going and gathering firewood and so on and so forth. And sometimes he would actually drive a supply wagon. Now, did they all tote guns? I've always wondered about that. Yes, they did, for different purposes. I've often seen in the movies where the cattle would run to the river because they could say they could a stampede because cattle could smell water. Most movies did that. Truth is, they did that. The cattle could smell water from a distance of 2 miles or more. And if they were thirsty, they made a beeline for the river. And of course, you tried to stop them, but it was almost impossible once they got started. In one of their early drives, crossing the Red River, a herd of 300,000 actually lost 800 head because they all run off of the banks of the river and they all piled in the river and they drowned. So that happened. Something else that happened was regular stampedes. Now, stampedes were caused mostly by lightning. There are other things that caused it. Anything almost could cause it. Now, on nights where the weather was bad, nobody slept. They were all ready to jump up and go in case there was a stampede. In the Westerns, the idea was to turn the cattle. That's exactly what they did. They tried to get as close to the head of the stampede as they could and turn it to the right. The idea was if they turned it in a circle, they would run into the back of the stampede and therefore it would slow down and stop. Now the best part, if there is a good part, come later. At the end when they had put their cattle in lots like they did on the east side of Dodge City and then loaded them into the rail cars to ship back east. When the trail boss paid the hands, usually the first thing they did was take a bath. They needed it. Some would burn their clothes or throw them away and go buy some new duds. They would shave or be shaved. And then a lot of them would actually rent rooms in the Dodge House. Yes, there really was a Dodge House. Or the Great Western Hotel. so that they could sleep in a bed for a night or two before heading back home to Texas. After that, they would, what they called, go find the elephant. Now, on the south side of the railroad tracks in Dodge City was where the saloons and all the nightlife, really where the danger was. And of course, being a cowboy, it's the first place they headed. Now, they did have places like that on the north side, such as the Long Branch, which was the most famous of all. But it was considered a little bit of higher class than on the south side. Although they did have trouble, and although they did have soiled doves. And sometimes there was a fight over a girl or something. But mostly it was on the south side of the tracks. After they spent most of their money, they headed back to Texas. Now, the cattle drive only lasted about 20 years because of one thing, mostly barbed wire. And of course, the train tracks were by now heading down toward Texas, so they didn't have to have the cattle drive. So let's watch the end of the trail. In 1865, the Civil War was over, and ex-Confederates began returning home to a financially devastated state. Texas was in financial ruin, but it had one thing: longhorn cattle, millions of them. For 4 years during the war, longhorns had roamed the free range and multiplied. Unbranded and unclaimed, they were there for the taking. However, they were almost worthless, as low as $2 per head. While Texas was awash with cattle, the eastern states were starving for the taste of beef. At one point, being willing to pay as much as $30 to $35 per head. This led to the creation of the cattle drives. There was basically 4 cattle trails coming out of South Texas. The earliest was the Shawnee Trail. It's the green line on the right. It was started back before the Civil War, running from South Texas through eastern Oklahoma, Indian Territory, into Missouri, branching off to St. Louis, Sedalia, and Kansas City. But by 1854, the Shawnee Trail was almost closed. The railroad had reached out further, and so had civilization. Farmers were beginning to turn around cattle drives. Longhorns were carrying ticks that they were immune to, but the farm cattle wasn't. With pressure from the homesteaders, the Missouri legislature had outlawed Texas longhorns in the state, basically closing the Shawnee Trail for good. It'll be 1866, 1 year after the war, when ranchers Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving established the Goodnight-Loving Trail, leaving Texas and traveling west some 75 miles to the Pecos River in order to skirt around most of the Comanche Territory, and then north along the Pecos to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, in order to sell beef to the Army. The trail will later extend to Denver and then on to Cheyenne, Wyoming. Also in 1866, a man by the name of Jesse Chisholm created the Chisholm Trail. The ranchers would gather up longhorns all the way from the Rio Grande in Brownville and travel to Wichita, Abilene, and Ellsworth, Kansas, where the railhead had reached. By 1871, the Chisholm Trail began slowing down. because homesteaders was flooding into eastern Kansas and began fencing off trails used by cattle drives. By 1872, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad had reached as far west as Dodge City, Kansas. For the next 2 years, the railhead at Dodge will ship some 850,000 buffalo hides back east. They also shipped thousands of pounds of buffalo bones to make fertilizer out of. Now, by 1874, the buffalo was gone, and so was the business that kept Dodge City alive. Also in 1874, the military had placed the Comanche and Kiowa on reservations following the Red River War, opening the way for cattle drovers like Captain John T. Lytle to open up a new trail from Texas through western Oklahoma to Dodge City, Kansas. That same year, Captain Lytle had drove some 3,500 head up what will become the Great Western Cattle Trail, sometimes called the Dodge City Trail. Within 5 years, the Great Western Trail will become the most used cattle trail in history, as the others were shut down from a growing population and cattle fencing. The Great Western Trail will continue until around the late 1880s, and in the last stages, it will continue through Dodge to Ogallala, Nebraska. Over a period of 10 years, millions of head of beef and 1 million horses will be driven up the trail. The Texans needed to get their cattle to market, so getting them to the railheads when they could be shipped back east was their only way. To start a cattle drive, each rancher would drive their head to a starting point. Each rancher had their own brand on their cattle to separate them from others. Then another brand would be placed on all the cattle to show that they belonged to this particular cattle drive. The most important decision made by ranchers was who will they hire to be the trail boss. The man responsible for seeing that their herd gets to the railhead with as little loss as possible. He would document each rancher's brand and the number of cows that he owned. The trail boss had complete authority. What he said went. No exceptions. He was sometimes paid as much as $125 per month, depending on the size of the herd. He would usually set the direction each day that the herd was to travel. The next highest paid member of the drive was the cook, sometimes making as much as $60 per month. The cook had strict rules around the chuck wagon. He was last to go to bed and first to rise. After breakfast, he would drive the wagon ahead of the herd and prepare the meals. Sometimes the cook would have a helper, usually a youngster that they call Little Mary. Now this is a Little Mary whose name has been lost to the ages. His job was to fetch water and firewood for the cook, and on longer drives he might even drive a wagon of supplies. Little Mary would also pick up stray calves in his wagon. Notice the little calf in the middle of the wagon between the bed rolls in the front and the saddle in the back. During the earlier drives, they would either kill calves for food to make stew or simply leave them behind. But they soon learned they brought too high of a price to eat or to leave. Now the next hired was the point men. In large herds there might be 2 point riders. They were usually the most experienced men on the drive. The point man rides up front so that he can point the cattle and keep them going in the right direction. They had the best jobs of all the drovers. The swing riders worked in pairs, one on one side of the herd and one on the other. They ride closely on each side of the herd about a third way back from the point riders. Everyone was responsible to gather in strays. About 2/3 of the way back on the herd is the flank riders. Their job was to keep the cattle bunched together as much as possible. At the back of the herd is the drag riders. Their job was to keep the herd moving and pushing the slower animals forward. Theirs was the worst job on the drive, from all the dust that the herd stirred up. Usually the most inexperienced drovers worked the drag. The drovers were paid around $35 per month. Drives usually begin in the spring, after roundup, when grass is readily available and before cold weather set in. Usually a crew consisted of 8 to 14 men. Each drover would pick his own horses from the remuda that he alone will ride during the drive. Each man would have from 3 to sometimes as high as 10 remounts each. They would change horses sometimes as much as 6 times a day. Their horses were continuously moving, chasing breakaway steers and keeping the herd moving forward. The drovers never was allowed to ride their own horses. The horses belonged to the drive. That way the drovers could not quit the drive and ride off on a horse that didn't belong to them. They hung horse thieves. The remuda would sometimes have 50 to 100 horses. Usually the wrangler who took care of the horses was a young drover whose job it was to see that they were fed and doctored when needed. The wrangler was paid around $25 per month, and he had sometimes helped the cook when needed. The remuda would travel behind the cook's wagon or where it was convenient for the drovers to change mounts. Notice how close the remuda is to the chuck wagon in this picture. Now, this is a map basically of the Great Western Cattle Trail. Drives would form as far south as Brownville, San Antone, Caryville, Mason, Lampasas, and San Angelo. The trail left Texas and crossed into Indian Territory, now western Oklahoma, to Dodge City, Kansas. Later, it will extend to Ogallala, Nebraska. Now, other trails later will travel as far north as Wyoming and Montana, supplying horses and cattle to remote ranches. A modern-day Highway 283 loosely follows the cattle trail through Texas, Oklahoma, and into Kansas. The first obstacle facing the drive was crossing the Red River from Texas into Oklahoma at Doan's Crossing. This is Doan's store, where the drovers could buy goods and chuck wagons could resupply for the trail ahead across Indian Territory. This is the only building still standing at Doan's Crossing. The river crossing was only a half a mile from the store. Now this is modern-day riders crossing the Red River. In 1 year, 5 drovers lost their lives crossing here. The trail from Texas to Dodge was approximately 600 miles. Cattle could travel as much as 10 to 15 miles per day. Trail bosses soon learned the faster you pushed the cattle, the more weight they lost, and the less money they would bring. Some drivers would arrive in Dodge after 2 months on the trail, if everything went perfect, which it seldom did. Sometimes a herd would string out as far as 2 miles depending on its size. Drovers had 3 meals a day with lots of coffee. They ate beans and stew and biscuits. They had sometimes stopped their herd at noon and let the cattle graze while the drovers ate their noon meal. After around 14 hours in the saddle, and after settling the herd down at night, they would gather around the chuck wagon for the final meal of the day. The chuck wagon carried in the back rolled up bed rolls for the cowboys, as you can see in this picture. They usually slept in a circle around the campfire. Now it's time to ride night herd. Each drover would have to pull a 2-hour shift, 2 at a time. One would ride clockwise around a herd, while the other would ride counterclockwise. They would often sing quietly to the cattle to help keep them calm.
Nighttime was the most dangerous time for drovers. Stampedes were more likely at night. During bad weather, everybody slept ready to go at a moment's notice. Lightning caused more stampedes than any other thing, but any noise could do the trick. Even after the Plains Indians were no longer a threat, sometimes a small group of hungry Indians would stop the herd and demand a few head. It was up to the trail boss to negotiate a deal, keeping in mind that if they were dissatisfied, they could easily sneak in at night and stampede their herd, causing more loss than the Indians were asking for to start with. Many cowboys were lost trying to stop stampedes. Riding full speed alongside hundreds of longhorns when your horse stumbles could be fatal. The only way to stop a stampede was to get ahead of the lead steers and turn the herd to the right until they began running in a circle. When the front of the herd runs into the slower moving rear of the herd, they eventually slowed down and stopped. During dry weather, thirsty cows could smell water from a long distance. The danger was that they would start running towards water and run off of steep banks, bunch up in the river, and drown. In one of the earlier drives, cattle bunched up in a swollen river where 800 head were lost out of 3,000. Lead steers were very important. Sometimes there'd be just one, and sometimes there'd be several. Leaders would come to the front of the herd by themselves, automatically. One such lead steer was Charles Goodnight's Old Blue. Now, Blue was a natural-born leader. Goodnight used Old Blue on 8 different cattle drives. It's been said that Old Blue would not take part in a stampede, that he'd just simply stand aside until it was over, and then he'd take his place at the head of the herd. Goodnight placed this bell around Old Blue's neck so that the rest of the herd would know where he was at and feel more contented. It's been said that Old Blue would not bed down with the rest of the herd, but would hang around the chuck wagon at night so that they would feed him biscuits and scraps. The cowboys were quite fond of Blue, and after some 20 years, Goodnight retired him to green grass at his J.A. Ranch in the Palo Duro Canyon in Texas. According to drover Nat Love, who was one of the most respected drovers of the Old West, stated in his memoirs that a braver, truer set of men never lived, or a tighter bonds formed than during a cattle drive. They was always ready to share a blanket or rations with anyone less fortunate. Although black cowboys faced the same discrimination while traveling through towns as other blacks, they received respect and equal treatment on the range and on ranches. Many ex-slaves headed west to join cattle drives. Some 35,000 drovers that pushed cattle up trails for some 12 years or more. From 5,000 to 8,000 of them were black cowboys. Some estimates go as high as 1 out of every 4 were black ex-slaves. Now, after crossing the Red River, the next major obstacle was the Canadian River. Here's the trail boss negotiating with the Indians after crossing the Canadian. After the Canadian, the trail boss would ride out looking for streams of water like this one outside of Fargo, Oklahoma, that herds would bed down close to at night, and cowboys would sometimes look for an opportunity to bathe. The last major crossing was the Cimarron River, close to the Oklahoma-Kansas border. By then, the herd was less than 100 miles from Dodge City, the end of the trail. When the herd reached Dodge, they were placed in holding pens on the east side of town, waiting to be loaded into boxcars to be shipped back east. After selling the herd, the trail boss would then pay the cowboys. With money in their pockets and ready to celebrate, most would first buy new clothes, then shave and wait their turn to take a bath. They might even take a room at the Dodge House where Doc Holliday had an office, or the Great Western Hotel, so that they could sleep on a real bed instead of the ground. Next came the gambling and drinking. Dodge had its share of saloons, but the Long Branch was the best known. Not all drovers got into gunfights and ended up in jail, but some did. Not all fights were over women. Here's a Dodge City working girl, black eye and all, that got into a fight with another working girl over a cowboy. After a few days' rest and recuperation, it was time to saddle up and take the long trail home, back to Texas. By 1885, most of the cattle drives were coming to a close, mostly because of the encroachment of barbed wire.